Jorge, let me pack you some sandwiches to take with you. I made them myself. At least you'll have something to snack on. It won't take long. Mom. The gray-eyed, tall guy in his 30s exhaled a few times, trying to calm himself. My dearest mother, there's no need, thank you. Well, you'll get hungry, and everything is so expensive at the airport. Mom, I earn enough to afford a sandwich and a cup of coffee. Suddenly, the woman gasped and pointed with trembling fingers behind her son. Jorge turned around and, seeing nothing, looked back at his mother, who was trying to slip his passport into the pocket of her silk robe. Mom. He took 2 steps and was by the blushing Lily's side, snatching the document. I don't understand what's going on with you, huh? Jorge shook his head disapprovingly. Since when can you cook? The woman sniffled and wiped her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief that seemed to appear out of nowhere. You're raising your voice at your mother, Jorge. When your father was alive, this never happened. I'm all alone now. You visit so rarely, and now you're leaving in the middle of your vacation, and you won't even let me prepare a light snack for you. The young man nervously glanced at the antique floor clock and squinted. I'm sure I checked the time half an hour ago, and it was right there. Mom, are these clocks broken or something? The woman pressed her open palm to her chest. These are your great-grandfather's heirlooms, Jorge. I have a clockmaker come annually. They show the time absolutely accurately. The young man rushed into the adjacent room. A moment later, his cry echoed through the house. Mom, I need to leave urgently. Your clocks, they've stopped. He appeared in the doorway, shaking his smartphone. It can't be. Lily raised an eyebrow. How could they have stopped? Can't you take a look? Maybe there's something wrong with their mechanism. Jorge snapped shut his suitcase and forcefully zipped it up. Mom, I'll definitely take a look. I'll keep an eye on them as long as you want, even though I have absolutely no clue about clock mechanisms. But only after I return. You do hear me, right? I'm only leaving for 2 days. The young man sighed. Our founder, Josh, was taken to the hospital with appendicitis, and we have the grand opening of the new branch, you understand. I'll quickly handle everything there instead of Josh and come back immediately, okay? And there are 2 more weeks of vacation ahead. You won't get tired of me by then. Lily pouted, crossing her arms over her chest. Jorge, you finally come to visit your mother once in a blue moon, and you're being dragged away by trifles. Hunt anyone else but you and this Josh open your silly branch. Mom, stop it. If someone else could, I wouldn't be flying out right now. Seriously, you're acting like a child. Who's the parent here, after all? The woman tapped the toe of her home slipper on the suitcase and suddenly made up her mind. Well, fine. Then I'll drive you to the airport. Jorge shuddered. Mom, I'll call a taxi. No need. He vividly recalled how his mother drove. No objections. I'll get ready quickly. And don't even think about sneaking away. And the woman disappeared into her bedroom. Jorge nervously paced the room. Actually, his mother's behavior today was entirely uncharacteristic for her. Professor Lily was a woman of refinement, capriciousness, and a slight aloofness. Yes, she unquestionably loved her son, but Jorge couldn't recall a single instance in his life when his mother had tried to feed him or see him off. Their family was quite, well, you could call it happy. His father, Matthew, had graduated from one of the most prestigious universities and set out to conquer the heights of human knowledge. The brilliant newcomer with a rare specialty was warmly welcomed into the leading scientific institute, where he met the young graduate student Lily. The unapproachable beauty had rejected all suitors, of which there were plenty within the institute. But then came Matthew, wild curls, piercing steel eyes, and strong hands. He was so different from most of the scientific staff that Lily was instantly smitten. Her heart fluttered. This didn't mean the graduate student would rush into the newcomer's arms. No, not at all. Absolutely not. Quite the opposite. As soon as the statuesque figure of Matthew appeared on the horizon, Lily's demeanor turned as cold as ice. Her beautiful blue eyes with heavy, thick lashes exuded contempt and indifference. Her plump lips pressed into a thin line, and her small, sharp chin tilted proudly upward. Matthew, accustomed throughout his young life to constant attention from girls, couldn't fathom what had displeased the local nymph so much. They had barely been introduced when the girl immediately inspected the newcomer with disdain, as if he were a microbe under a microscope. let out a meaningful snort, and, turning on delicate high heels, swiftly left the laboratory, leaving Matthew in dumbfounded amazement. The following month was agonizing for Matthew. From the very beginning, he had no plans to enter into any burdensome relationships within the walls of the institute. The young man was completely immersed in his scientific work, striving to build a career and make a name for himself in his field. Why introduce complications into life in the form of a constant girlfriend who would only be a distraction, demanding attention? Matthew didn't have much free time, so he was content with occasional outings to the movies or parks with old university friends. But Lily, oh, this Lily, she barely spoke a few words, and during all the time they worked together, she didn't look at him, not even during scientific meetings. She tried to sit as far away as possible, although they were both in the same laboratory. What on earth is going on? Thought the exasperated Matthew. I can see she gets along just fine with the other staff. The young man couldn't concentrate on his work, gloomily watching the beautiful Lily burst into melodic laughter, listening to the flat jokes of the graduate student Naveen. This Naveen, skinny, ugly, and already starting to go bald. Matthew grumbled to himself. And she's holding onto him, giving him those smiles. Matthew, with sinful thoughts, began to doubt his own attractiveness. However you look at it, everything seems fine. The young man once again stopped by the mirror in the spacious institute hallway. He puzzledly tilted his strong chin, covered with a day's stubble. Maybe I should shave more often. Oh, what nonsense. Just at that moment, the junior research assistant Matthew met the gaze of the passing graduate student Lily in the reflection. Steel gray eyes collided with heavily blue ones. A shiver ran down the young man's spine. Lily, who hadn't had time to wipe the dreamy expression from her face, immediately pressed her lips together and turned away. What was that just now? Both embarrassed young people thought simultaneously. For the next 24 hours, the entire research institute celebrated International Women's Day. At the institute, it was customary to celebrate any significant holiday with enthusiasm. The organizing committee was actively preparing food. The management allocated funds for buying gifts, and the staff chipped in for the festive table. Matthew was tormented by doubts. Of course, he was deeply involved in the festive performance. He could play the guitar and had a pleasant singing voice, which automatically made him the highlight of the program. But Matthew wanted to personally congratulate Lily. Would that be appropriate? Matthew pondered in the morning while buying expensive roses at the market. What if she gives me a piece of her mind with this bouquet? The guy sneaked into the laboratory, placed the flowers in a jar, and hid them in the closet. After a few minutes, Lily appeared, surrounded by dressed-up colleagues. In the girl's hands, there were already several bouquets. Matthew sneakily scanned the flowers: tulips, lilies, carnations. The guy chuckled with satisfaction. The celebration was scheduled to start at lunchtime, and no one was in a working mood anyway. All the staff gathered in the conference hall, where the institute's director first delivered a rather dull speech, followed by a cheerful performance by the youngest members of the team, ending with Matthew singing a few songs. The women were in awe, blushing slightly when Matthew, dressed for the occasion in a white shirt and black pants, took the stage. He sat on a tall stool and ran his long fingers over the strings. The room filled with a melancholic melody, and Matthew sang softly, his microphone amplifying his smooth baritone voice to the farthest corners. Lily gazed at Matthew with radiant eyes, unaware of her own expression. She lightly bit her lower lip and leaned forward, catching every word of the sad song about an unfulfilled first love. After finishing the first song, Matthew performed a few more, then stood up and took a bow. The hall erupted in applause. Matthew waved his hands awkwardly and promised to play the guitar again after the banquet. Glancing at the dark rose, he hesitated for a moment but then pulled a bouquet of roses from his guitar case and, walking deeper into the hall, presented it to the frozen Lily. The girl, as if in a trance, reached out and embraced the flowers, pressing her blushing cheeks against the delicate petals. It seemed like Lily had finally accepted Matthew's advances, but that wasn't the case. When the guy tried to get closer to her during the banquet, she once again cast him a look full of disdain. "What's going on?" Matthew seethed with righteous anger. "No, I'm absolutely sure she liked my flowers," he thought, raising a few toasts absent-mindedly along with everyone else. Eventually, The young man concluded that Lily simply didn't like him at all. Roses are roses, but there's not a hint of affection. Drooping, Matthew sat down in a corner and began to pluck the guitar strings. Within moments, a group of girls gathered around him. Clenching her fists so that her nails painfully dug into her palms, Lily watched with a hateful gaze as Matthew, tilting his unruly head and looking tenderly at the lab assistant Margaret, sang a beautiful song to her. "And what, no dancing today?" Lily asked with a piercing voice, lifting her chin. "Isn't it time to put on some music?" she added. The girls sitting next to Matthew immediately protested. They definitely wanted to hear Matthew's enchanting voice some more. The standoff didn't last long. Matthew set aside his guitar and smiled reconcilingly. "Sure, everything's fine. I'll sing for you all again sometime," he said. He grabbed his windbreaker and went out onto the balcony without looking back at Lily. The organizers immediately started playing loud music, and the girls began pushing Lily towards the center of the room. "Well, you wanted to dance, didn't you? So go on, dance," Margaret hissed sarcastically. Lily, raising her chin proudly, began to move, casting imperceptible glances toward the balcony from beneath her lowered eyelashes. "Is he smoking out there or something?" she wondered to herself. But when she noticed that even the detested Margaret was heading toward the balcony, she panicked. "And where is she going? She's like a pale mote, and she's heading there too." Lily suddenly turned around and moved to the wall, plopping down on a chair in a huff. "He gives roses at first, and then sings songs to someone like Margaret. Chirk." Meanwhile, a touching and slow melody began, and a deep voice sang about rain on the glass and Madonna. Lily, with her arms crossed over her chest and tapping her foot in her narrow shoe, tried to hold back her tears. "Would you like to dance with me?" The girl raised her eyes. Matthew, smiling sadly, extended his hand to her. Lily immediately snorted, got up from her chair, shook out the hem of her dress, and placed her delicate fingers in his large masculine palm. The girl didn't respond to her partner, but she walked with him to the middle of the room and stopped, waiting for further action. Matthew tenderly embraced Lily around the waist and gracefully spun her in the dance. This marked the beginning of their love story, which lasted for more than 30 years. Throughout all the time that Lily was with her Matthew, she did not lose any of her character traits, whether good or bad. Their relationship resembled an endless and contradictory chemical reaction. Lily would sometimes chill her beloved, then bliss him with rare, gentle warmth, and other times, she would ignite him with undeniable passion. Jorge knew that his parents loved each other to madness, and he, their son, was merely the logical continuation of that love. His father's attitude towards Jorge was very warm and respectful, while his mother was always slightly capricious but moderately so. She was undeniably proud of her clever and handsome son, but she wasn't particularly skilled at expressing her love. After Matthew's death, Lily naturally felt lost. There was no longer a reliable broad shoulder by her side, no forgiving, loving husband, no sense of warmth. Many years ago, Matthew had taken his young wife from the comfortable Detroit to Washington to work in a closed laboratory. It was there that Jorge was born, and it was there that he grew up and finished school. His parents didn't abandon their scientific pursuits, so their son grew up with a deep respect for knowledge. However, he chose a path far from his parents' field and went to New York to study information technology. After graduating, he found a job at a small, startup company, which had grown significantly over the past 7 years and had branches all over America. For the first time since his father's funeral, Jorge had finally come for a proper vacation. Lily hadn't budged an inch from her position. She was still the same petite, melodious woman with her languid movements, and her elderly admirers were always ready to offer support in her professorial apartment filled with antiques. Jorge sighed as she appeared in the doorway once more. The woman twirled a car keychain around her finger and shook her head. "Well, son, let's go. I'll get you there in perfect shape." Jorge had personally given his parents the car a few years ago, using a substantial bonus he received for his first closed project. The powerful SUV suited his tall, burly father perfectly, but diminutive Lily behind the wheel looked somewhat comical. "Mom, let me drive after all," Jorge suggested. "Don't make things up. I want to send you off properly, and besides, you're not listed on the insurance," she replied. Lily climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and within 5 minutes of driving, Jorge was on edge. "Mom, why are you driving so slowly?" Jorge asked, clearly recalling how his mother usually sped when she was behind the wheel. "It's only about 10 kilometers away, but we're crawling, so I'll definitely be late," he added. "You won't be late," Lily stated confidently, slowing down even more. "You know, the slower you go, the further you'll get," she said. "Fine, I'm getting out." Jorge unfastened his seat belt. "You don't need to stop. At this speed, I can easily jump out while we're moving," he remarked. "The door is locked," Lily replied, continuing to drive the car at a snail's pace. "I'm going as fast as I can," she added. Jorge looked at the nearly empty road. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked. The car suddenly swerved to the side of the road and came to a halt. Lily turned to her son and grabbed his hands. "Son, I had a dream." Lily's eyes widened. "The very bad dream. You must not take this flight." Jorge's jaw dropped. "Mom, I need to catch this flight right now. I'll be late for the opening. Don't you understand? You're a physics professor, and what's all this about believing in dreams? You've never talked to me so rudely before," Lily complained in a tearful tone. Jorge closed his eyes. "Mom, why on earth are you suddenly believing in dreams? What nonsense. Let's just call a taxi quickly, and I'll leave. You can return home calmly and safely. Okay, you could even slow down a bit more, and by tomorrow morning, you'd be back home." Lily started the car again and stepped on the gas. Jorge was pushed back into his seat. "You can fly wherever you want, and then I'll fly with you, got it? I have no one else left, only you. I'm not going to sit at home and wait for bad news." "So don't wait," Jorge said, involuntarily squinting before the next turn. "You're not flying anywhere with me. What's all this nonsense?" A few minutes later, Lily abruptly braked in front of the airport building. "I dreamt that your plane disappeared from all radars," the woman said, staring ahead. "I sat there waiting, but there was no news. The plane just vanished, son." Lily turned to Jorge and grabbed his cheeks. "Don't you dare not arrive safely. Don't you dare." Jorge pulled away from his mother, rubbing his jaw. "Everything will be fine, Mom." He quickly embraced the woman with delicate shoulders, grabbed a suitcase from the trunk, and rushed to the entrance. Lily sighed heavily, watching her son with her eyes. She felt unbearably heavy-hearted. The dusty yellow taxi was filled to the brim. In addition to 4 passengers and the driver, there were numerous bags, suitcases, and a few backpacks in the back seat. A woman with her hair neatly tied in a bun sat in the passenger seat, grumbling angrily. She cast a disapproving glance at the driver. "As a taxi driver, you are obligated to provide services of appropriate quality. Why is your trunk filled with all this junk?" The driver remained silent. A well-mannered man with a beard spoke from the back seat. "Kimberly, can you at least not create a scene now? There are no available cars. I ordered what was available." The woman shot a sharp glance in the rearview mirror. "I don't understand you at all, Dominic. Why do we have to bring her with us?" Kimberly waved her hand disdainfully towards the girl who sat quietly in the backseat between the man and the teenager. "Kimberly," Dominic's voice took on a steely tone, "I'm not going to argue with you about this again. If you feel like conflicting, please wait until we land. Have at least a drop of conscience." "Oh, so apparently I have no conscience. Yes, I guess I brought her home, didn't I?" "Kimberly, be quiet," her husband abruptly cut her off. The woman covered her eyes. How did it all come to this? Could she recall the last day when she felt happy? Could they still be considered a family? Kimberly sighed and stole a glance at the girl, who huddled in a ball, staring straight ahead. She felt a familiar, painful ache in her chest. "We've arrived." With relief, the taxi driver said. Emily had been staring absent-mindedly at the display of souvenirs for 20 minutes. "Can I help you with anything?" a saleswoman politely inquired. Emily, snapping back to reality, shook her head and walked away from the counter. 2 girls rushed by, one very young, about 5 years old, and the other a teenager. The older one held the younger girl's hand and explained something to her with a smile. The little one nodded seriously in response. Emily held her breath. She felt as if she had seen a ghost from the past. There she was, leading little Michelle by the hand through a shopping center illuminated by Christmas lights. Her daughter had a contented look on her face as she read every Merry Christmas sign in sight. Emily chuckled. Someone called her name. She turned and looked at a vaguely familiar figure she couldn't make out the face in a crowd surrounded by cheerful Christmas music. A little hand slipped out of Emily's grip. Michelle would be around 14 now. Nearly 10 years had passed. Emily didn't realize that big tears were rolling down her pale cheeks. The tattered theater posters depicted couples dancing, candles, and a young, beautiful face in a black half-mask. The bat was written on the sheet. A well-groomed, beautiful woman carefully folded the posters and put them into a small velvet bag. She briefly glanced at Emily crying in the corner. The actress took out her phone and took a few pictures. The registration was almost complete, with only a few people left at the counters. Jorge, scowling at his smartphone screen, lined up at the end of a short queue. In front of him, a hesitant teenager anxiously looked around. A woman with a weary face had just left the registration counter, making the teenager even more anxious. Jorge sighed. "Have your parents gone somewhere?" he asked the boy. The boy looked around in confusion, and his eyes suddenly lit up with joy. "Are they already here?" A lovely young woman approached the boy, smiled, and dimples appeared on her round cheeks. "Let's go. Your parents will be here soon." The girl pulled the boy towards the counter. A moment later, a married couple joined them. Jorge observed the interaction of the strangers. The older woman, with a sour expression, snatched the passport from her husband's hand, which caused him to mumble quietly. The boy, looking at his parents, was nervous, tugging on the already stretched sleeve of his sweatshirt. The girl remained composed, only furrowing her brow once when the woman got too close. Finally, the family finished their registration and left the counter. Jorge quickly stepped forward. The cheerful girl handed him his boarding pass. "Registration for American Airlines flight number 415 is complete. All passengers are kindly requested to proceed to the boarding gate," she said. Jorge sighed in relief. "Phew, made it." Checking the departure board, Jorge headed towards the appropriate gate. The familiar family, now complete, was also heading in the same direction. Nearby, right on the floor, sat a dark-browed man with a slender eagle-like nose. This strange passenger was dressed in a luxurious cashmere coat that was currently mercilessly wiping the airport tiles. In his hands, the stranger held a tattered book with a soft cover. His sharp, slightly elongated eyes were devouring the lines of text. A little further away, a woman in her 40s sighed and stared into emptiness. Deep shadows rested on her eyes. The corners of her mouth were downturned in sorrow, and her hands were tightly clasped together. Jorge didn't even know why he was noticing all these details that had nothing to do with him. But this habit had been with him since childhood. The slightest pause in his activities would lead to Jorge instantly scanning his surroundings, unconsciously memorizing every detail. Someone tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me, young man." The woman in her 40s, with a rather eccentric Marlene Dietrich-style hairdo, dressed in a solid black dress with white lace at the collar and cuffs, cast a sly glance at Jorge. "No problem." Jorge politely smiled and moved aside. The woman stood next to him and started playing with a long strand of pearl necklace hanging from her neck. "Quirky, isn't he?" She nodded in the direction of the man sitting on the floor. "Do you think he's flying with us on the same flight?" The man, who had probably heard this phrase before, didn't even raise an eyebrow, continuing to read his book. Jorge squinted slightly, trying to make out the title. The cover was adorned with an unpleasant image of a plane breaking apart. "The Final Flight," Jorge read and involuntarily shivered. "What's wrong with me?" He scolded himself immediately. "It must be my mother's crazy talk about dreams from today. Boarding for American Airlines Flight 415 is now beginning." A voice came over the loudspeaker. Passengers immediately formed a line. Jorge chuckled. He always found this rush during boarding amusing. What was the point of trying to be the first on board when the plane would take off at the scheduled time anyway? Wasn't it better to just settle into your seat? What was the hurry? You'd get tired of that seat over the course of the flight anyway. The family that had checked in just before Jorge turned out to be the closest to the boarding gate. The woman was talking to her husband, the teenager was looking away distantly, and the little girl was teasing the boy, trying to make him laugh. Jorge entered the plane as one of the last passengers. There were still quite a few empty seats. Well, thank goodness my mom didn't find out, or she would have rushed to buy herself a ticket. Jorge smirked to himself as he walked through the cabin. His seat was by the window. The two other passengers in the row were the same girl with dimples and the teenager. Seating himself, Jorge immediately fastened his seat belt and impatiently waited for takeoff. He preferred to sleep on the plane, but falling asleep before reaching cruising altitude often led to a headache. At that moment, there was some commotion in the adjacent row. "No, I just don't understand why I can't ask. After all, the child should be flying with his parents." A woman's voice sounded annoyed. Jorge narrowed his eyes and unsurprisingly saw the mother from the familiar family arguing with her husband. "But Ian is sitting next to his sister," the man replied wearily. "Don't disturb anyone, I'm begging you." "But she's not his sister," the woman huffed. "He dragged some unknown girl to us. Fine, I put up with it, but Ian and I don't know her, and she's nobody to us." "Oh, how you're annoying me," the man said, turning away from his wife. "And you're annoying me, so we're even." She turned to the passenger sitting by the window. The woman, seemingly oblivious to the argument, continued to slowly blink, tracing her finger along the window pane. "Listen, could you please switch seats with my son? They've seated us separately for some reason." The woman waved her hand actively, beckoning the teenager to her. Startled, the passenger raised her eyes. "With your son?" "Yes." The woman vigorously gestured, urging the teenager to come over. The boy looked helplessly at his sister and reluctantly stood up. "Mom, we're just sitting across the aisle from each other. Why do we need to switch?" "But we have to," the woman insisted. With an almost frantic expression, the passenger looked at the teenager and asked, "How old are you?" 14, the boy replied, surprised. "My daughter is the same age." The woman stood up. "Go sit with your parents." She looked closely at the mother of the family. "Keep an eye on him. Don't take your eyes off him." Ian nervously shuffled to his new seat, and there was a strange passenger in his place. "Are you okay?" the girl asked sympathetically. "No, I'm not okay, and I won't be until I find her," the woman replied. The passenger stared at the headrest of the seat opposite her. Then suddenly, she grabbed the girl's hand. "What's your name?" she asked. "Oh." The girl flinched but didn't pull her hand away. "Elizabeth." "I'm Emily. Do you have kids?" "No." The passenger squinted. "Why?" In response, the girl blinked nervously. "Well, I'm not married yet." She blushed slightly. "So?" Emily suddenly laughed, her eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. "Ha, you don't have to be married. Do you know what a joy a child is? The indescribable warmth that fills your heart every time your child reaches out to you, laughs, cries, babbles." Elizabeth stared wide-eyed at her seatmate. Jorge, listening to this peculiar dialogue, frowned. Yes, this flight is definitely strange. All these people around, they seem like characters from a melodramatic novel, painted with broad strokes. The family with the crazy mother, that woman with the manic look, and the lady in the black dress. They all seemed like they stepped out of the pages of a battered book that the gloomy guy in the cashmere coat was reading. What was it called? The Final Flight. Jorge chuckled. "I can't wait to take off and finally immerse myself in sleep." The flight attendant droned on about the safety rules on board. Jorge checked his phone one last time. There was a message from his mother. "Michael called, your deputy, asking if you made it to the flight." "I made it," Jorge replied briefly and switched his smartphone to airplane mode. The aircraft slowly began to move, gradually gaining speed. Jorge, looking out of the window with a hint of nostalgia, wasn't particularly fond of the moment of takeoff. Those brief seconds when the landing gear softly leaves the ground and the bulky aircraft seems to hang outside of time and space before gaining altitude. In the cockpit, it was a typical work atmosphere. The ship's captain, Harold, sipped scalding strong coffee from a thermos mug made by his wife. "I envy you." The second pilot, Terry, glanced at Harold. "If I found someone like your Cynthia, I might get married too." "Why would a woman like Cynthia need a slacker like you, Terry? Have you thought about that?" The captain chuckled. The second pilot immediately smirked. "Don't worry, you'll find your happiness too, I'm sure. You're still quite young. Meanwhile, enjoy your freedom." Harold, who became a father for the third time less than 6 months ago, considered himself a connoisseur of family life. He was indeed lucky to meet the perfect woman right from the start, with whom he was ready to spend the rest of his life. Cynthia was well known to the entire crew. Over 10 years ago, the very young Cynthia, fresh out of civil aviation school, came to work as a flight attendant. Harold had just recently taken up the position of second pilot and was full of enthusiasm at the time. The aircraft was then commanded by the universally acknowledged handsome pilot, Henry. But Cynthia didn't bat an eyelid when the charming pilot began to flirt with her upon seeing the attractive newcomer. She flawlessly performed her duties, always ready to assist her colleagues or fill in for the sick ones. Cynthia quickly earned the respect of the crew. Henry didn't give up easily, and his pursuit of the unyielding flight attendant became something of an obsession. Eventually, Cynthia couldn't take it anymore and, in front of the entire crew, firmly rejected the advances of the persistent captain. Focused on his flight hours and honing his skills, Harold seemed to have an epiphany. He looked at Cynthia with entirely different eyes, and what he saw greatly appealed to him. The blushing Cynthia, hands on her slender waist, was sternly reprimanding the captain, who had averted his gaze. The tall Henry appeared pitiful and gloomy next to the slender, audacious Cynthia, whose beautiful eyes sparkled with righteous anger. Pursuing Cynthia, "No, that's dangerous," she rebuffed the captain so firmly. In that case, how would she treat an ordinary second pilot? Harold wondered. One day, the senior flight attendant, Beth, approached Harold. "Harold, why the long face? You've been moping for days. Tell me, what's bothering you?" Harold let out a long sigh and raised his dark eyes to the heavens. "Beth, why is love so complicated? You, who never took your eyes off the monitors and were so immersed in your work, now suddenly infatuated. Who is she?" "Harold, why do you assume it's someone from our crew?" Harold protested, suddenly remembering Cynthia's radiant smile. "Where do you get these conclusions?" "Oh," Beth said with a smirk. "Haha, this is getting more interesting by the minute. You see, I was entirely engrossed in my work. I didn't notice anything around me." Harold concluded hopelessly. "What should I do now? Look for another job?" "Why do you think Cynthia turned down Henry? Why does she bring you tea with homemade pastries and her own homemade broth on every flight? Why does she gaze at you intently during meetings?" Beth inquired. Harold shook his head. You're what? She would never say that to me in real life. But since it's come to this, and you finally deigned to pay attention to her, well then." Harold resolutely got up and walked into the break room. Cynthia was casually chatting with colleagues when Harold approached her and blurted out, "Cynthia, would you like to go to the movies with me?" "I'll go," she replied calmly. Captain of the aircraft, Henry, who had been sipping tea nonchalantly, choked and coughed loudly. Harold beamed with a happy smile. Since then, Harold and Cynthia were inseparable. A couple of years later, they got married, and later on, Cynthia took her first maternity leave, from which she never returned to work as a flight attendant. Instead, she smoothly transitioned into motherhood, giving birth to their second child. When Henry switched to another airline job, Harold took the captain's seat. Every flight, he began with the traditional thermos from Cynthia. His wife never missed sending off her pilot. Harold glanced at the photograph that accompanied him on every flight. Cynthia with her fluffy mound of light hair, their elder son Malcolm hugging the middle one, Jeremy, and tiny Rebecca cradled in Cynthia's arms. Suddenly, Harold heard strange interference in his headphones. Pilots were generally accustomed to rare in-flight emergencies. Years of familiar routes, routine movements, and standardized procedures. The co-pilot also noticed the unusual sounds and frowned. "I don't understand. Is the dispatcher trying to contact us, or are the headsets just glitching?" he wondered aloud. Harold shook his head. "I think it's some kind of malfunction, but it's better to double-check." Terry nodded and reached for the control panel. At that moment, a low metallic voice came through their headsets. "Captain Harold, it is in your best interest to listen to me calmly and do as I say." Both men silently looked at each other. The voice continued. "Malcolm, Jeremy, Rebecca, Cynthia, I believe these names are familiar to you." Harold felt a jolt of electricity run down his spine, making it hard to breathe. "Why, who are you?" the captain responded, trying to maintain his composure. "That is of no consequence. You don't need to know who I am. It's enough that I know everything about you and your loved ones. Right now, Your wife and children are in danger. They are alive, and everything is fine with them. Captain Harold, as long as you do what I tell you." Something clicked and crackled in the headphones, and a piercing child's voice could be heard. "Daddy, Daddy, where are you?" The voice abruptly cut off. Harold clenched his jaw. "What's happening?" "It's quite simple, Captain. You need to make a choice. There are only a few hours left in this flight. In the end, either your family will remain safe and unharmed, or the plane you're piloting will." Harold felt his head splitting apart. "I don't understand," he exclaimed. "There's nothing to understand here." The voice grew harsher. "Captain, either crash the plane, or your family will die. They are all in my hands. Cynthia, Malcolm, Jeremy, and Rebecca. If the plane lands, if it touches the ground intact, your family won't survive. Is that clear? Now make your choice." An oppressive silence hung in the headsets. Harold turned to the co-pilot. "Harold." Terry struggled to think, trying to find any way out of this catastrophic situation. "We'll immediately contact the dispatcher. I'm sure this is all a bluff. Your family is safe at home." Terry faltered, looking at the manic expression on the captain's face. "Harold, there are over 100 passengers on board. You can't seriously be thinking about—" The co-pilot didn't finish his sentence. Harold jumped from his seat, grabbed Terry by the throat in a chokehold, pulled him out of his chair, and threw him out of the cockpit. Blocking the entrance, he sat back down and cradled his head in his hands. Just think about what to do." Outside the cockpit door, there was commotion. Seeing Terry, pale as a ghost and barely standing, the senior flight attendant, Julie, was shocked. She attempted to enter the cockpit, but the door wouldn't yield. "What's happening?" she asked another flight attendant. Creating panic on board was entirely inappropriate, so the flight attendants carefully led the co-pilot away from the door and sat him next to the beverage cart. Julie returned to the cockpit and gently knocked. "Captain, what's going on?" "The co-pilot isn't feeling well." "What happened?" Instead of a response, Harold's voice came through the speakers. "This is Captain Harold speaking to you. Our current altitude is—" Harold calmly recited the standard message pilots give after reaching cruising altitude. Passengers listened, some with curiosity and others with indifference. Julie quickly glanced at the cabin. There was no panic. Everyone seemed calm. She knocked on the door again. "Harold, what's happening?" "Carry on with your duties. Everything is fine." Harold replied softly and fell silent. Julie returned to the unconscious Terry, where another flight attendant was helping. She quickly examined the pilot and found a lump on the back of Terry's head. He seems to have hit his head," she whispered. "But how did he end up here, and why did the captain lock himself in?" Julie, after a moment of consideration, quickly fetched the first aid kit and found some smelling salts. She moistened a cotton pad and held it under Terry's nose. He jolted and opened his bleary eyes, looking completely disoriented. "Darn it, he still needs help." Julie muttered to herself and grabbed the intercom handset. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor among you, please come to the flight attendant." Jorge immediately noticed the strange commotion among the flight attendants, which had started right after the fastened seatbelt signs were turned off. Hearing the announcement, he became suspicious. "What's going on?" "They've just taken off, and someone is already feeling unwell." Jorge surveyed the cabin. None of the passengers have even had a chance to get out of their seats. "So, who needs a doctor?" "A crew member." "This is not good at all." Elizabeth, seated next to him, nervously glanced at the aisle, focusing on the woman with the family. The woman, who had been rummaging in her bag, heard the flight attendant's call and set aside her luggage before standing up. Making her way down the aisle, she approached the flight attendant and softly inquired, "What happened?" At this moment, she looked nothing like the hysterical individual who had been constantly berating her husband. Jorge asked the young woman, "Is your mother a doctor?" Elizabeth shook her head and replied, "She's not my mother. And Kimberly is my dad's wife, and yes, she's a cardiothoracic surgeon." "Oh." Jorge peered attentively toward the aisle. "So who's feeling unwell after all?" "It's a relief that she's here." "Yes." Elizabeth nodded. "She's a really good doctor." After a minute, Kimberly returned to her seat and grabbed her bag. She turned to Jorge. "Young man, can you help me? I would ask my husband, but he has an old spinal injury, and he can't lift heavy things." Jorge, whose curiosity had been piqued, immediately got up and followed the woman. In the corner of the tiny storage area, next to the metal cart that flight attendants usually use to offer beverages, a young man was sitting on the floor. Jorge glanced at his uniform. A pilot. "Well, I hope the second pilot is okay. It seems he has a pretty severe concussion," Kimberly whispered to him. "And because this happened during takeoff, with the change in pressure, he hasn't regained consciousness. Help me lay him down." The woman pointed Jorge to a flat surface that the flight attendants had managed to clear. "All right, I'll need to monitor him because there's a risk of increased intracranial pressure, which could lead to a stroke." Jorge nodded and, gently lifting the almost unresponsive pilot, carefully laid him on the panel. "We need to secure him somehow," Kimberly instructed the flight attendants. "We need straps or something else, and place a folded towel under his neck. Also, he might start vomiting, so keep an eye on that." "Actually, wait." Kimberly returned to the middle of the cabin and motioned for Elizabeth to follow her. The young woman complied silently. "My husband's daughter recently graduated from medical college. She's a paramedic." Elizabeth, "Watch the patient." Kimberly briefly described the pilot's condition. "If anything happens, call me immediately," she said sternly. She returned to her seat, leaving the young woman with the injured pilot. Jorge, who had fulfilled his duty, continued to pace in the same spot. "So, what happened?" he finally couldn't resist asking the flight attendant. She looked at the young man with confusion. Julie understood that it might not be appropriate to disclose on-board problems to outsiders, but at this moment, she simply didn't know what else to do. "It's a rather puzzling situation. Our second pilot ended up outside the cockpit door, which is locked, and the captain is not responding." The flight attendant trembled, fully aware of how ambiguous her words sounded. She immediately regretted sharing all this with the passenger. What if he panicked? However, Jorge's face remained impassive. "Let's try to hack the door," he calmly suggested. "It's an electronic lock." Julie waved her hand. "In case of emergencies, the pilots can lock the doors, and you can't just open them." "Electronic." Jorge scratched his head. "Wait a moment. I'll get my bag." Jorge quickly returned and opened the overhead compartment. Kimberly looked at him questioningly. "It's okay. I'll help them with something else," the guy explained and left again. "Okay, so I have some knowledge of microchips and electronics, as well as radio technology," Jorge explained to the flight attendant. "I've been into this stuff since I was a kid. I'll take a look at the door lock." Jorge took out a set of miniature screwdrivers and began dismantling the electronic panel. Elizabeth wiped the forehead of the injured pilot with a damp towel. The man's skin was covered in a cold sweat, and his breathing was uneven. The girl sighed. The whole situation seemed very strange to her, but she didn't show any curiosity. After all, she had long been accustomed to silently analyze any incident. Elizabeth's gaze became distant. Why had everything turned out this way? Elizabeth was born in a small southern seaside town. As far back as she could remember, every morning was illuminated by her mother's sunny smile. Her mother was an incredibly cheerful person. They lived alone in a small house surrounded by fig trees, with a cozy gazebo covered in grapevines. The sea was right nearby, just a stone's throw away. All it took was to step out the gate and walk down a steep path to a small rocky cove. Elizabeth's childhood was filled with sunshine, the scent of flowers and herbs, the sweetness of honeyed figs, and laughter. She was content with this little world they shared with her mother. She asked a few times where her father was. After all, in their small town, almost everyone had complete families, so Elizabeth and her mother stood out. "Your father lives very far away." Her mother's lips curved into a soft, dreamy smile. "He's very kind, and he's very handsome, Elizabeth. He knows how to do so many things, and talking to him is so interesting. Why doesn't he live with us?" The little Elizabeth wondered. "Well, you see, dear, sometimes people meet only briefly. Your father and I come from very different worlds. But our encounter was not a mistake because you came into the world, my little sunshine." After several such conversations, Elizabeth realized that asking her mom about her father was pointless. There was no way to obtain any concrete information. Well, it's not like she was particularly interested, but when Elizabeth was 12, her mom fell ill. At first, it was hardly noticeable. The woman just got a little more tired, slept a bit less, and ate a bit less. But with each passing month, her mom became paler and more fragile. Her smile faded, and her eyes lost their enduring sparkle. One day, her mom called Elizabeth to go for a walk. Slowly descending along the rugged path, the woman sat down on a large rock, watching the waves rolling onto the shore. "Elizabeth, my dear, do you remember asking me about your father? Well, I want to tell you something." And her mom revealed that Elizabeth's father didn't know he had a daughter. It turned out her mom had met him during a vacation. At the time, the young woman was studying at a university in the neighboring resort town. That's where she met a young student who was on vacation with his friends. "We immediately liked each other," her mom recounted. "It was all very beautiful, intense, but short-lived. I fell in love with him very much, but I knew it was just a holiday romance." Elizabeth. Before leaving, the young man asked for her address so they could correspond. She gave him the address of the dormitory where she lived during her studies, but never responded to his letters, even when she found out she was pregnant. "Elizabeth, I didn't see the point in it. He was focused on his career, and I just wanted to live in my little house by the sea. You're the result of our love, and I thought I'd never have to involve your father, but now I have no other choice." Her mom sighed heavily and confessed to her daughter that the illness had progressed too far. She didn't want her daughter to be left all alone, so she contacted her father and explained the situation, and now she was waiting. He was, of course, surprised. Her mom sighed. "After all these years, he didn't even know of your existence. But believe me, Elizabeth, he's a very good person, and he won't abandon you." For several days, the girl cried. It was very difficult for her to learn, at such a tender age, that her mom was about to leave this world. Moreover, Elizabeth didn't want to go to her unfamiliar father. She loved her home, her sea, her son. But in life, things rarely go as we wish. Elizabeth's mom passed away 6 months later, and an unfamiliar man with kind eyes, a soft voice, and a gentle nature came for Elizabeth. Her mom had already arranged the necessary documents, so after the funeral, their little seaside house was closed, and the girl went with her father into a new life. Besides her father, Dominic, this new life also brought a cold and perpetually dissatisfied woman, her father's wife, Kimberly. They also had a common son, Ian. Elizabeth immediately felt an all-consuming love for her brother, just as he did for her. However, her relationship with her stepmother was not so rosy. Now, at 23, Elizabeth understood that Kimberly was not obligated to be friendly to her husband's illegitimate daughter. Yes, Dominic and Elizabeth's mom had met before Kimberly even entered the man's life. And yes, Dominic had no idea that there was a child from that resort love affair. Initially, Kimberly treated her stepdaughter indifferently. She didn't show either indifference or aggression. It seemed that the woman was trying not to notice the new resident in her own home. On the contrary, Dominic tried to pay as much attention to Elizabeth as possible. She had lost her mother not too long ago, had to leave her familiar environment and move. Of course, she needed care and understanding. Elizabeth spent most of her time with her newfound younger brother, Ian. She enjoyed playing with him, strolling around the yard, and teaching him to read. This considerably eased Kimberly's life, but on the contrary, the woman became gloomier with each passing day. 2 months after Elizabeth moved into the new family, a scandal erupted over a trivial matter. Dominic returned from work and brought ice cream portions for the kids. In addition to that, he bought a new book for his daughter. It was an expensive, high-quality edition of a veterinary encyclopedia. The gift acted as a catalyst. Upon seeing the price tag on the book, Kimberly exploded. Without mincing her words, she yelled at her husband, "You've poisoned our family. You brought your past mistake here, and now I have to feed, care for, and raise her. And now you're favoring her over your own legitimate son. You're not interested in Ian anymore, are you? And what about me? Did you ever think about how it feels for me to see the result of your love with another woman? Dominic, what do you want from me? If I had known I had a daughter, I would have certainly told you about it before starting a family, but things turned out the way they did. What are you suggesting now? The girl lost her mother. Why can't you understand that, Kimberly? Why me, of all people? Why am I the one who has to be understanding and forgiving, huh?" Elizabeth, clutching the bright book to her chest and huddled into a ball, sat on the floor in the children's room. Next to her, little Ian trembled. He had never heard his parents argue like this before. Elizabeth raised her teary eyes and stared at the wall. Many pictures of a happy family adorned it, with Kimberly smiling or laughing, kind-hearted Dominic, and the little joyful Ian. And now I've come along and ruined everything, Elizabeth thought, but I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose this fate. Since that scandal, everything changed as if a massive dam had burst, and a torrent of water washed away all the happiness that once surrounded this family. Only emptiness remained, upon which something could be built or abandoned, like barren land to start anew. Kimberly no longer called Elizabeth by her name. She didn't address the girl unless it was absolutely necessary. When talking about her stepdaughter, Kimberly used only the word "this one." This one is late for school again. She can deal with it herself. Let this one clean up the children's room. I'm not going to clean up after her. Dominic himself became more sullen and withdrawn. He never lashed out at the children, but the atmosphere of warmth and tenderness that always surrounded him suddenly dimmed, losing its power. Elizabeth counted the days until her 18th birthday. She was determined to leave them after finishing school, enroll in a veterinary academy, and then return to her hometown, to the little house by the sea. But when Elizabeth turned 17, an unexpected event occurred. Dominic got into an accident and suffered a serious spinal injury. The man found himself bedridden for a long time. Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to leave her father and go away. She took care of him diligently, sharing this duty with her stepmother. After observing Kimberly for many years, Elizabeth suddenly changed her dream. She decided that it was much better to become a doctor for people than for animals. Therefore, she studied to become a paramedic, planning to further her education and become a physician. When her father's condition improved, Elizabeth got a part-time job, rented a room, and moved out of Dominic's apartment. She wanted to irritate her stepmother as little as possible. After all, Elizabeth considered herself responsible for the family's constant turmoil over the years. She often met with her brother and father. As for Kimberly, they hadn't seen each other for the past 2 years. Circumstances forced the family to come together again, as Dominic's mother, Elizabeth, and Ian's grandmother had passed away. That's why they were now flying to her funeral. Elizabeth dampened the towel again and placed it on the pilot's forehead. He groaned softly and opened his eyes. Meanwhile, there was a somewhat nervous atmosphere in the airplane cabin. Gabriel, sitting next to the peculiar man who was engrossed in a book about the final flight, decided to strike up a casual conversation. "Excuse me, what are you so engrossed in?" she inquired. The man diverted his focused gaze from the pages, looked attentively at Gabriel, and smiled. "Do you think we'll make it to our destination?" The actress bestowed her interlocutor with a radiant smile. "Of course, we'll definitely make it. I'm absolutely certain of that." "Oh?" The man raised his thick black eyebrows. "Where does such confidence come from?" Gabriel languidly reclined against the back of her seat and tilted her chin upward. "You see, my dear, I'm an actress." "That was practically evident," her companion remarked. "Well then, dear, with our plane, nothing will happen, I assure you." She gestured disdainfully towards the book the man held in his hands. "I'm not flying just because. I'm flying to secure the most significant role of my life, and it's destined for me to play it." "Destined? On what grounds?" "I just know." Gabriel ran her fingertips along her cheek. "And have known for a long time." Gabriel had known her destiny since childhood. She was beautiful, vibrant, and artistic. What else could she be but an actress? As a little girl, Gabriel participated in every imaginable performance within her reach. She was raised by her father. Her mother had passed away early in her life, and she became her father's sole source of joy. Therefore, he tried to provide her with everything she needed. Gabriel's father held a high position in a large company, and for the active Gabriel, all doors were open. "Darling, I'm sure you'll enroll in the local theater school. He'll undoubtedly become the star of our theater, but in the capital. Listen, you might just get lost there, and I won't be able to help you. Do you understand?" her father told her. And Gabriel had to accept it. She easily got into drama school. The daughter of an influential father was welcomed with open arms. Right after graduating, she secured a warm spot in the academic theater. Moreover, they immediately cast the unknown actress in the leading role of a new production. Gabriel triumphed. Dreams do come true. You just have to want them. But as soon as she started rehearsals, something terrible happened. Gabriel's father suddenly passed away. The role in the play was promptly given to another, more experienced actress. Gabriel was relegated to the background. She was cast as a member of the ensemble. She tore and threw tantrums, but it turned out that without her influential father, she couldn't do anything on her own. Gabriel played court ladies, shepherdesses, maidens, and adolescent boys, but she was no longer given any significant roles. In the theatrical community, there were whispers that while Gabriel was attractive, her acting skills were quite mediocre, and her voice was weak. The young actress felt that despair was gradually enveloping her, until one day, a fateful encounter occurred. Gabriel came to visit her father's grave and complain about her career failures. Next to the gravesite stood an unfamiliar woman with a book in her hand. Seeing Gabriel, the woman greeted her warmly. "You must be the late one's daughter, right?" "Yes," Gabriel reluctantly replied, trying to keep her distance from the stranger. "Things haven't been going smoothly for you, I can tell." The woman opened the book and flipped through several pages. "But believe me, you'll have a very important role in your life. The most crucial one, the one that only you can play." "What?" Gabriel looked surprised at the stranger. "Where are you from? Why are you talking like this?" "This is the Book of Fate." The woman turned the volume in her hands. "Everything is written here. You'll understand when your time comes. I'll come to you in a dream." Gabriel blinked, and in the next moment, she realized she was standing at the grave all alone. Everything that had just happened seemed like a mystical delusion. The more time passed, the more Gabriel became convinced that her main role awaited her in the future. The actress continued to play insignificant roles, but she stopped feeling despondent. Gabriel had brief, meaningless romances, easily met people, and just as easily let them go. She never started a family. Her entire life passed in dreams of her real leading role. Many years had passed since then. Gabriel turned 50, and suddenly, a few days ago, she had a dream. The same stranger with the book in her hand was standing by the grave. "It's time," the woman said and vanished again. Gabriel woke up with her heart pounding furiously. "So, I will get my leading role." And a day later, she received an offer from a cultural center. They wanted to cast Gabriel in the leading role of a new production. Taken aback by the surprise, Gabriel, who was on tour with the theater at that moment, pretended to be ill and bought a plane ticket. She was only one step away from realizing her dream. Gabriel looked mysteriously at her fellow passenger once again. "I assure you, we will definitely reach our destination." "Sure," the man chuckled, immersing himself in his book again. "But what if my destiny is something entirely different? For example, to die in an airplane crash. Just then, you'll die on another plane, not this one." The man seemed surprised but decided not to argue and continued reading. The co-pilot tried to focus on the blurry face that was leaning over him, still not understanding who was currently wiping his forehead with a cold cloth. He grabbed the girl's hand and quickly began to speak. "Harold, someone is threatening him. I don't know who. Probably criminals who have taken his family hostage. They're threatening to kill them all if he doesn't crash this plane." Elizabeth startled and turned to Jorge, who was fiddling with the lock. He nodded grimly, indicating he had heard everything. Jorge connected a microchip to his laptop and began rapidly going through control points. A few minutes later, the electronic lock beeped and the door opened. The senior flight attendant immediately rushed towards them, and together with Jorge, she entered the cockpit. Harold looked at them sternly but remained seated at the controls. His expression gave nothing away. "Harold, what's going on?" The flight attendant cautiously placed her hand on the captain's shoulder. "Who threatened you?" "Julie, I'm begging you, don't touch me right now." Harold stared stubbornly ahead, and Jorge took a step closer to the captain, casting a glance over the instrument panel. Of course, understanding anything was impossible. "Have you disabled the autopilot, haven't you?" Jorge ventured a guess. "Yes," Harold honestly replied. "I've disabled it." "That doesn't mean you intend to destroy an entire plane with 100 innocent passengers on board, does it?" Jorge asked. Captain Harold raised his pained eyes. "I can't do it, and I can't not do it. I just don't understand what I've deserved all this for." What should I do now? Jorge rubbed his temples. All right, all right. So, have you tried to contact the air traffic controller? Harold nodded silently. Well, let's try again. We need someone to find out if your family is at home right now. Why find out? My family has been taken hostage. Harold hissed through his teeth. Jorge sighed. He had already noticed the photograph of an attractive woman with 3 children attached to the panel. I understand you're emotional right now, but you can't just trust whoever fed you this nonsense. Make contact with the ground, Captain. Harold finally reached out and tuned into the required frequency. Air traffic controller. This is Captain of Flight 415, American Airlines. It's urgent. Harold provided his details, address, and his wife's phone number. Please, try to contact my family. I repeat, it's urgent. The air traffic controller said something in response. After listening, Harold leaned back in his seat. She'll take care of it now. Minutes of agonizing waiting passed. Jorge watched the pilot attentively, ready to grab him at any moment. He could imagine the unstable emotional state the captain was in, so Jorge tried to remain calm himself. Julie was wringing her hands anxiously nearby. Her face was deathly pale. Finally, they heard sounds from the headphones again. Harold listened to the dispatcher's response and turned to the others. They're not at home, and my wife isn't answering the phone. In that same moment, Jorge swiftly pulled Harold out of his seat and pressed the pilot to the floor. The stewardess gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. Give me something to tie his hands with, Jorge whispered. I'm sure this is some cunning scheme. No one has taken his family hostage, but leaving him at the controls is just too dangerous. Julie looked at the captain with pain in her eyes and rushed to find some rope. Harold, securely bound, sat on the floor with his back against the wall. I didn't make any decision myself. He stared distantly at the ceiling. But without me, he'll surely perish. Can any of you operate the autopilot? No, we can't, Jorge honestly replied. You'll have to instruct us, or I'll contact the ground and request instructions. But then, for you, it's over as soon as we land. Do you understand? Regardless of what happens with your family, you'll be a criminal. Captain, grasp that. Untie me, and I won't do anything. I'll fly the plane as usual, Harold pleaded. Jorge shook his head. That won't work. It's too risky. He turned to the flight attendant. Julie, can you check on the second pilot? Is he coming to his senses? The young woman nodded and quickly hurried off. She couldn't bear to look at the captain, who was now tied up and lost. Dominic, sitting next to his wife, was staring out the window. Ian, with his forehead pressed against the seat in front of him, was fast asleep. Kimberly, let's get a divorce, the man quietly said to his wife. The wife turned her head and looked into his eyes attentively. In her mind, she recalled the past few years, the arrival of Elizabeth, her anger toward the girl, the despair and hopelessness. Kimberly couldn't understand why she was acting this way. She had never been quarrelsome. In her graduating class, she had been the top student, and professors predicted a brilliant career for her. She knew her own worth. Kimberly had always pursued her goals relentlessly, working tirelessly to become a top-notch specialist. She had achieved that. If one were to remember what she was like about 10 years ago, an image of Kimberly would come to mind. After a grueling shift at the hospital, she would return home with an ever-present smile. She performed surgeries, made her rounds, wrote prescriptions, but at home, she was full of warmth. She would embrace her beloved husband, kiss the chubby cheeks of their son. Life seemed so complete, so fulfilled. Her husband was the provider. She was engaged in her beloved profession, their long-awaited child, a cozy home, an atmosphere of love. But one evening, Dominic approached her with a contorted face, and Kimberly immediately understood that something irreparable had happened. Holding her head in his hands without looking at her, Dominic told her about his long-standing affair during one of his vacations. At that time, he and Kimberly hadn't even met. The girl herself wasn't exactly saintly before their wedding. There were dates, breakups, but the existence of Dominic's illegitimate daughter struck Kimberly's heart like a sharp dagger. She had been a rational woman, to some extent, a cynic like all doctors, but she couldn't do anything about it. Bitter, painful jealousy corroded her soul, muddled her thoughts and feelings. After hearing her husband out, Kimberly asked, "Why do you have to take the girl? You don't even know her." Let her grandmother or the state take care of her. Why us? She wanted to shake her husband so hard that his head would spin. She wanted to shout in his face. How could you? How dare you have a past that's destroying your present? Fix this, Dominic. Make it as if it never happened. But Dominic, her gentle and kind Dominic, of course, couldn't act any differently. What are you saying? She's my daughter, and she's about to become an orphan. Kimberly, of course, I have to take her. She's nearly 13. She doesn't require the same care as a baby, understand? Kimberly froze then, and afterward, she icily replied, do whatever you want. It was precisely for this softness and warmth that she had once loved her Dominic. Could he have acted differently? He would no longer be her husband but a stranger. But when Elizabeth appeared in their home, when she befriended little Ian from the very first moment, when Kimberly saw Dominic's care for the girl, she couldn't stop being angry. Kimberly understood in her mind that she was poisoning everything around her own family and the life of a girl who was, after all, not to blame. Kimberly was poisoning her own soul. And now, the thing she had feared the most had happened. Her husband, her beloved, was looking at her with vacant eyes, proposing a divorce. You want a divorce? Now, when she has finally left our family alone. Kimberly felt that she was speaking the wrong words. Kimberly, you all are my family. You, Ian, and Elizabeth. But you've been competing with the girl, my daughter, for so many years. You exude hatred. I can't take it anymore. Ian had already woken up long ago but continued to pretend to be asleep. Painful thoughts were racing through the boy's mind. He didn't remember well the time before Elizabeth entered their home, but he knew for sure that his sister loved him while his mother hated his sister. That's how Ian had grown up in such an atmosphere, and now he wondered what it would be like if his parents separated. Who would be left for him? Would his father still love him, or would he grow distant? The teenager's heart clenched painfully. Jorge looked into the hazy eyes of the second pilot. Terry, can you hear me? Yes, I can, Terry weakly replied. Can you help us? Please, turn on the autopilot. I probably can't. I can't see anything. Everything is swimming before my eyes. Jorge sighed. The situation was utterly unbelievable and hopeless. Suddenly, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. The strange guy with the book about the plane crash. Jorge thought, what's happening here? The stranger calmly asked, scanning the unconscious second pilot with a sharp gaze. Can I help with something? Jorge smirked. But aren't you just a civilian pilot? Unexpectedly, the man nodded. That's right. I have over 6,000 flight hours. What happened? Did the pilot get sick? Julie rushed to the stranger. Can you activate the autopilot? The flight attendant asked. She grabbed the man's hand and led him into the cockpit. He quickly assessed the situation. Seeing the bound captain and the pale faces of those present, he glanced at the instrument panel and shook his head. I haven't been behind the controls for over 10 years, and I'm not familiar with this aircraft at all. The only way I can help is by contacting air traffic control and asking for instructions. That way, I can figure things out. Jorge turned to the grim herald. We'll deal with the problems as they come. Right now, I don't see any point in reporting your actions. We'll contact the ground and say that both pilots fell ill after being threatened by unknown individuals. If we land, you'll have to explain yourself to law enforcement. Harold nodded gloomily. It seemed like the pilot had completely disconnected from the outside world. All of his thoughts were focused on his family. Meanwhile, the stranger settled into the pilot's seat. Jorge watched him cautiously, troubled thoughts racing through his mind. What if this guy is connected to criminals? He might crash the plane on his own. Jorge slumped into the co-pilot's seat and put on his headphones. At least this way, he would be able to hear what the air traffic controller was saying. This is former aircraft captain Rodrigo Dale. The man spoke clearly into the microphone. He quickly explained the situation. The dispatcher was clearly flustered. She said she would immediately find an active pilot to help the man with the instruments and also call the police and an ambulance to the arrival airport. So, you're a pilot yourself? Jorge asked the man. Why did you decide to read such an unusual book during the flight? Rodrigo chuckled. This book, it ended up with me by chance. Before the flight, I asked my sister, who I was staying with, to give me something to read. So, she handed me the first thing she found. But you are reading it so passionately. Well, yeah. The man calmly nodded. I'm Yakut, and I grew up in a traditional environment. When I was a teenager, our shaman gave me a prediction. He said that I would be soaring in the clouds until I turned 50, and after a big bird would drop me from its back, and then I would join a little blackbird. Until I became a pilot, it never crossed my mind to decipher the shaman's message, but then I realized what he meant. Our shaman rarely made mistakes. People traveled to him from all over the country, so I decided to heed his words. I retired at 45, Rodrigo sighed bitterly. I'm not sure if I can avoid a tragic ending. I turned 50 yesterday, and now the big bird is about to shake me off its back. Julie paled after hearing these words and looked helplessly at Jorge. He just grinned. We'll see about that. Shamans can be wrong too. Emily got up from her seat and looked around. Her seatmates had disappeared somewhere. However, the woman wasn't particularly curious. Since her daughter, Michelle, had disappeared 10 years ago, Emily's gaze had been focused solely on finding her Michelle. She was now flying, following the thin, almost invisible thread that she had pulled from another tangled ball. How many of these threads had there been? How many roads had she traveled? And how many disappointments and pain had she endured? Only the heavens knew, as Emily daily implored for their help. No one around her believed that she could find her daughter. The longer the time passed, the more elusive her hopes became. Her husband and both grandmothers had long since resigned themselves to the loss, but Emily pushed forward, dedicating herself every day to searching for her beloved daughter. Emily was a fairly well-known artist, and her paintings had taken a darker and more troubled turn after her daughter's disappearance. They became gloomier and more foreboding, but their value among art enthusiasts had only risen. All the time not spent searching for Michelle, Emily poured into her grief on canvas. Only once a year, on her daughter's birthday, did the artist paint another portrait of Michelle, 1 year older. These paintings she kept at home, never showing them to anyone or putting them up for sale. All other paintings she sold, using all the proceeds to hire private detectives, fortune tellers, and psychics. On that pre-Christmas day when she let go of Michelle's hand, Emily's whole life was turned upside down. Emily vaguely remembered how she had run through the shopping center in search of her daughter, how she had pleaded with the security guards to retrieve the surveillance footage. Only after several days did the police obtain the recordings, which showed the blurry figure of a woman leading a little girl away from her mother through the crowd. Emily divorced her husband a year after Michelle's disappearance. He could never forgive her carelessness. On one hand, he pitied his wife. On the other, he blamed her for losing their daughter. At first, both of them had searched for the girl, appearing on television and begging the kidnapper to return their daughter. But with each passing day, Michelle's father lost hope, while Emily remained steadfast in her belief. She would find her daughter. She would find her without fail. The woman's face darkened as she recalled a recent chance encounter. Her ex-husband was holding the hand of a little boy, while his pregnant wife walked beside him. When he saw Emily, he hesitated for a moment, then handed the child to his wife and approached quickly. Looking at her exhausted face, he said with pain, "Emily, you need to move on. Wherever she is, Michelle is already 14. She doesn't even remember you. Just let go and live your life." "Well, I see that you've let go." Emily smiled wryly. "But I could never do that, even if she doesn't remember me. I remember her, and I need to know that she's okay. I wish you happiness in your new life." At that moment, Emily felt like striking that smooth, shaven face. Yes, she recognized her guilt. She, the mother, had lost sight of her daughter. She had lost her. But the ease with which Michelle's father had moved on to a new life troubled her. It seemed to her that her ex-husband had betrayed their little lost daughter, given up on the search, and resigned himself. He had acquired new children, as if they were replacing a stolen phone. Emily couldn't fathom it. The woman walked through the cabin, stretching her legs. Bright eyes watched her curiously from one of the seats. "My neighbor seems to have disappeared. Your companions seem to have vanished too. Join me, and we'll chat." A well-spoken voice spoke up. Emily looked in surprise at the stranger in a black lace-collared dress. "Well, I need to gather some impressions. I'm flying for an audition," the woman replied. Emily shook her head and quickly returned to her seat. What a strange person, she thought. However, Gabriel wasn't so easily discouraged. The woman got up from her seat and headed determinedly toward the front of the aircraft. Since her seatmate had disappeared there, she needed to find out what the commotion was that had the flight attendants bustling around. However, at the end of the cabin, a polite flight attendant stopped the actress. "I apologize for the inconvenience. If you need to use the restroom, please proceed to the rear of the plane. We are trying to fix everything, but the restroom in this section is currently unavailable." Gabriel tried to peek over the flight attendant's shoulder, but she was politely but firmly pushed away. The actress snorted and returned to her seat. Leaning over the back of her seat, she turned to Emily again. "It looks like something's happening. There's commotion near the cockpit. Do you think we should be worried?" Emily shrugged in response. However, a sense of unease had taken root in her heart. She had to safely reach her destination at all costs. Tomorrow would mark exactly 10 years since her Michelle disappeared, and Emily felt that this time the thread would lead her to the right place. The actress remained displeased with her neighbor's lack of reaction. She plopped back into her seat, crossed her arms over her chest, and pouted. The 50-year-old woman looked a bit comical, playing the role of an offended child. However, there were no spectators around, so her pose went unnoticed. Suddenly, the plane shook. It felt like the aircraft had plummeted into a massive hole. Passengers who weren't fastened in their seats jumped in their chairs. Emily clutched the armrest and stared out the window in horror. No, it's just turbulence. They'll make it. They'll make it safely. After all, her daughter, her Michelle, is waiting for her. Gabriel fastened her seatbelt and picked up the fallen book from her neighbor's seat. "A massive Boeing is on a transatlantic flight," the actress read aloud. "The entire crew is incapacitated due to a strange set of circumstances. Can a retired pilot land the plane and save himself and the passengers? What nonsense." Gabriel snorted and then turned to Emily sitting behind her. "Who reads such books on a flight? It's a recipe for a panic attack." When the plane jolted, Kimberly was just about to get up from her seat. The sudden bump caused her to stagger, and she ended up sitting on her husband's lap. She sat down next to the very husband who had recently proposed a divorce. Dominic instinctively hugged his wife. He caught the familiar scent of Kimberly's perfume. He held his wife closer to him and let out a sigh. He truly didn't know what to do. He couldn't just abandon his teenage daughter back then, and at the same time, he felt guilty towards his family, Kimberly, and Ian. Kimberly continued to sit on his lap, pressed against his chest, not resisting his embrace. Ian, witnessing this scene, quickly turned his gaze to the window, feeling the awkwardness. Meanwhile, Rodrigo was in communication with air traffic control. One of the pilots was at the microphone, urgently but meticulously explaining to the former captain how to stabilize the plane and adjust the autopilot. The intelligent aircraft had been flying without control for a considerable time. However, despite the autopilot being disabled, the plane continued along its preset route. But without a skilled hand at the controls, when it hit an air pocket, the aircraft started losing altitude. As Rodrigo worked on stabilizing the aircraft, he remained tense. Even after reaching their destination, the plane still needed to be landed. Unfortunately, in windy weather, automatic landing was impossible, so they would have to land the plane manually. Rodrigo wasn't entirely confident he could do this in an unfamiliar aircraft model. As they approached their destination, Captain Harold grew calmer. Finally, he turned to Jorge, pleading, "I'll land the plane. I swear I won't harm anyone." Jorge shook his head. "It's impossible. Captain, you must understand. We can't risk the lives of so many people. If it were just about your safety, perhaps I would trust you, but not now, not under these circumstances." Without diverting his attention from the controls, Rodrigo briskly declared, "We are beginning our descent. Everyone, please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. The landing will be rough." Jorge grabbed the captain's shoulder and led him out of the cockpit. He placed him in a flight attendant's seat, fastening his seat belt, then directed Julie to the co-pilot's chair. "Elizabeth," he leaned towards the young woman who continued to monitor the condition of the co-pilot. "You, Elizabeth, need to return to your seat." The girl shook her head. "I can't leave him. What if he starts vomiting or feeling unwell? You won't be able to maintain your balance here, and you'll get hurt if the plane starts rocking severely. Understand? Please return to your seat. Jorge firmly took the girl by the elbow and led her into the cabin. Elizabeth fastened her seat belt but continued to nervously glance towards the cockpit. It was at that moment the plane began to vibrate, causing passengers to exchange worried looks. Is it already time for landing? Shouldn't they announce it beforehand? As if on cue, the voice of a flight attendant came over the speakers, announcing the imminent landing. She also shared information about the temperature at the arrival point and the estimated landing time. Rodrigo listened intently to the instructions from the pilot in his headphones. He had always felt at ease in the sky, but this time was different. He had never felt the weight of responsibility for others' lives so intensely. The former pilot felt as though Lady Death herself had perched on his lap, gripping his vulnerable throat with her sharp, bony, and cold hands. Kimberly moved back to her seat and fastened her seatbelt. Dominic cautiously touched his wife's hand. She didn't pull away, so he entwined their fingers and gently squeezed Kimberly's hand. She responded with a faint smile. The plane swayed from side to side. Pale-faced passengers sat quietly, gripping the armrests. Suddenly, a sharp jolt shook the aircraft, causing all internal organs to lurch. The plane leaped off the ground, then touched down again, followed by another jump. "What's going on?" someone shouted. "Why such a rough landing? If you only knew what's happening. Consider this the smoothest landing of your life," Jorge thought, staring intently out the window. The plane finally stopped bouncing and began to roll along the runway, gradually slowing down. Jorge let out a sigh of relief. Without waiting for the aircraft to come to a complete stop, Elizabeth jumped out of her seat and rushed to check on the co-pilot. Jorge followed the girl. Elizabeth exhaled when she saw that her charge was no worse. Jorge, on the other hand, quietly conferred with flight attendant Julie. After a brief argument, they both approached the still-bound Harold. Jorge untied the ropes and took a step back. "You must understand that you probably won't be able to work as a pilot anymore," Jorge said. Harold nodded grimly. "I don't care anymore. I just want to know where my family is." Jorge shrugged. "We've landed. You can try calling your wife again." The captain pulled his smartphone out of his pocket and, holding his breath, turned it on. The phone started chiming with incoming messages. Harold opened his messenger app and paled. "My wife, she's messaging me. She says the neighbors called her mother's place. My mother-in-law isn't feeling well, so Cynthia went there with the kids." Harold grabbed his head. "What have I done?" Jorge looked at the captain with confusion. "Your mother-in-law lives very far away. There's no cell signal there, so the neighbors called from the nearest spot with reception." Harold quickly dialed his wife's number, and there were long rings. "Harold, have you landed already?" Cynthia's cheerful voice came through. Harold leaned against the wall and gripped his jacket tightly on his chest. Have you returned from Mom's already?" "Yes. It turns out she wasn't feeling bad at all. She can't understand why the neighbors called me. Probably just some mistake." "No, a mistake," Harold replied. Tears of relief and bitterness rolled down the captain's cheeks. Several police cars and an ambulance had pulled up next to the stationary plane. Harold watched the bustling scene with detachment. Most passengers didn't realize how close they had come to the edge. People chatted cheerfully and formed a line in the aisle. The boarding stairs were brought to the plane, but passengers were not allowed to disembark yet. Finally, the door opened, and several figures in uniforms appeared in the doorway. The police calmly explained to the bewildered passengers that everyone would need to go through interviews before leaving the airport building. Only then could they go home. Jorge took out his phone and called his deputy, but the recipient was unavailable. Meanwhile, doctors with stretchers quickly entered the aircraft cabin. They took the co-pilot and, after confirming that there were no other injuries, Terry was taken away. Passengers gradually left the ill-fated plane. The police directed the flow of people. The majority could simply be asked a few questions and sent on their way, but there were those who had been directly involved in the incident. They faced longer and more serious discussions. After answering the same questions multiple times, Jorge finally left the airport building and let out a sigh of relief. Glancing at his smartphone screen, he realized he still had time to make it to the branch opening. He hailed a taxi and called his mother. During the descent, he had already sent her a message, but his mom continued bombarding him with questions on Messenger. "Mom, I've landed. Everything's fine. I'm heading to the branch." he said into the phone. Jorge, why did you call so late? What were you doing all this time? Did the flight go well? Lily asked with an agitated voice. I was tracking your flight online, and at some point, you disappeared. Do you have any idea how I felt? It was exactly like in my dream. Don't you ever scare me like that again, my son. Mom, these things happen. You can't rely on online tracking. Understand? It's a good thing she doesn't know, Jorge thought. Otherwise, we'd have hysterics on our hands. By the way, Michael called me several times. His mom informed him. He was so worried if you would make it. Jorge suddenly became alert. Since when had his deputy become so nervous? Something wasn't adding up. While Michael was certainly competent and highly talented, he typically kept to himself. Moreover, his position as deputy was largely nominal. He didn't involve himself in organizational matters. Jorge finished the call with his mother and deep in thought. He had studied alongside Michael in the same group, and Michael had been considered a local genius when it came to all things mechanical, electronics, and machinery. Jorge couldn't even remember how they had become friends, but in the end, they did. The quiet and introverted Michael wasn't particularly popular. Everyone knew of his talent, but his unsociable character and introversion didn't make him very charismatic. At one point, Jorge even took his classmate with him on vacation, so Jorge's mother, Lily, was well acquainted with Michael. However, that trip didn't seem to sit well with Michael. He remained silent and moody in the company of Jorge's former classmates. Any attempt to engage him in conversation was met with short replies. Jorge, being sociable, often dragged his friend to student gatherings, but Michael never quite fit into social circles. Nevertheless, when Jorge started working, he brought his former classmate along. As the company expanded, Jorge became a full-fledged department head, but Michael remained in the development department. Jorge had a long and persistent argument with the director about his friend. He's very talented, and we can't keep him at this position. You must understand. Jorge, you have to realize that a managerial position involves communication, management, and administrative work. Michael simply isn't capable of that. Yes, he's a brilliant developer, but why do you want to make him do something he has neither the inclination or the ability for? Josh, it's not about that. If we leave him without a promotion, the competition might snatch him up. He's just a grumpy programmer to us, but in reality, he's capable of so much more. If someone finds out about it. Besides, he's contributed a lot to our company. In the end, Jorge managed to get Michael appointed as his deputy. Listen, you won't have many additional responsibilities, Jorge explained to his friend, but your salary will be much higher. Plus, it's prestigious. It's so much nicer to introduce yourself to girls as a boss rather than just a developer, right? Jorge smirked. Michael gratefully accepted the new appointment while continuing to immerse himself in the development department. Now, why is he suddenly so concerned about the branch opening? Jorge thought, sitting in the taxi. Or is it not about the branch? What am I thinking? Why are these strange thoughts creeping into my head? Jorge dismissed his suspicions. After all, he had just experienced a traumatic event, so he was probably inclined to blame anyone he could find. If it weren't for the chance encounter with former pilot Rodrigo, would all the passengers of Flight 415 be alive now? Suddenly, Jorge's phone vibrated in his hand. He answered the call without looking. "Hello," he said, and there was a tense silence on the line. "How was your flight?" Jorge frowned. "Everything's good, Michael. Why are you calling?" "I just wanted to check if you're making it to the opening on time or not. You know, I flew in for personal matters just yesterday, so I thought that if you ran into any difficulties, I could, well, as your deputy, help." A storm of emotions swirled within Jorge. Was this really Michael? The introvert wanted to participate in a social event. What on earth was happening? "Everything's fine," Jorge calmly replied. "But if you want, Michael, come to the opening. There will be a banquet afterward." "I'll come," Michael said shortly and hung up. Kimberly, Dominic, and Elizabeth were sorting through things in their late grandmother's house. The funeral was scheduled for tomorrow. Elizabeth was going through old photo albums. "Look, Dad, your wedding pictures." Elizabeth opened the albums and handed them to her father. Dominic, with a smile, examined the not-so-high-quality photos. Their wedding had been the simplest and most budget-friendly affair. A young Kimberly, dressed in a light blue dress with a wreath, held a bouquet of flowers and laughed. Next to her was Dominic, looking like a hippie in blue jeans, a t-shirt, and shoulder-length in kid hair. The couple looked harmonious, as if the photos were taken for a themed magazine. "We were so happy," Kimberly murmured, looking at the photo over her husband's shoulder. "And Kimberly, forgive me," Elizabeth suddenly said, wiping away her tears. "It's my fault. Why did I come to you?" Kimberly looked at her stepdaughter with wide eyes and suddenly burst into tears. She embraced the young woman and began to stroke her hair. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me. You're not to blame for anything, Elizabeth. It's all because of me. My jealousy, my hatred poisoned everyone's life." Dominic looked on in astonishment at his daughter and wife, who were embracing. Ian walked into the room, and surprise was evident on his face too. This horrible abscess had been festering for 10 long years, and now it had burst. Along with the pain and tears pouring out in an endless stream, there was relief and a peculiar kind of happiness. "What's going on?" Ian finally spoke up. "Why are you crying, Mom? Are you and Dad getting a divorce?" "Nobody is getting a divorce," Dominic cut in. "We all just need to sit down and talk." "I don't want to talk," Kimberly suddenly sobbed. "I've said so much over the years. Forgive me, okay? Forgive me. I was wrong. I was wrong too." "No, it's my fault," Elizabeth said. The teenager sighed. "You're at fault. You're at fault. And you're at fault. You're all acting crazy today." Emily walked down the street, checking her route on her smartphone. Another knot was almost untangled, and the moment of truth was approaching. It was either another dead end, or at the end of this thread, she would find her Michelle. Not long ago, a private detective had contacted her, the one she had turned to for help. They had finally found a lead. The surveillance camera footage at the shopping center had been utterly inconclusive in identifying the woman who had taken Emily's daughter. The detective had done meticulous work, trying to identify women who even remotely matched the description and had visited the center that day. One of them had remained elusive for a long time. Her trail disappeared almost immediately after the girl's disappearance. And now, the detective had found the suspect's current address. Moreover, this woman had a 13-year-old daughter. While the age didn't completely match Michelle's, if the kidnapper had manipulated fake documents, it wasn't surprising. Emily sighed and approached the right house. Just then, a teenage girl rushed out of the entrance, followed by a woman in her 50s. "Mom, I'll go get some bread myself," the girl yelled. "You wait here, and then we'll go to Grandma's together." Emily's heart froze in a lingering, sweet pain. It was her. A little mole at the corner of the eye. A scar on the wrist from a childhood fall off the swings. Those light curls. "Michelle," she whispered almost inaudibly. Stepping back, she kept her eyes fixed on the slender figure that had hopped toward the nearest supermarket. Emily followed. The girl grabbed a package of bread from the shelf and headed to the checkout. "Give me another Kinder Surprise." She handed the cashier some money. "Here you go, Sonia." The woman at the register handed her the treat. "How's your mom? Not feeling sick?" "No," the girl answered cheerfully. "After the surgery, everything's fine. We're heading to Grandma's now. Good luck." The cashier smiled. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, watching the girl. She swiftly passed by and ran toward the entrance. From there, she and her mother leisurely set off somewhere. "I found her. I found her." The burning thought raced through Emily's mind. There she is, all grown up, beautiful, and alive. Suddenly, Emily sank to the floor. The alarmed cashier rushed over to her. "Are you okay?" No, I'm fine." Emily was suffocating. She suddenly realized she had no idea what to do next. Here was her daughter, but how could she approach her? How could she say that her entire previous life had been a deception, and that this seemingly kind-faced woman was not her mother at all, but a vile kidnapper, a destroyer of lives? Could she do this to her cherished, long-awaited daughter? What about punishment for the crime? What about sweet revenge? What about the joyful reunion? Or would the joy be only for her, Emily? Would Michelle, now Sonia, only receive pain? "I thought I recognized this girl," Emily said quietly, "but it must be a mistake. She looks like the daughter of my former neighbor." "Sonia?" the cashier asked. "By the way, they moved here a very long time ago. About 10 years ago, I think." Nikki has been raising her on her own her whole life. She had her late, you know. She said she struggled with infertility. She went to all the monasteries, all the doctors, all the healers, but she got pregnant eventually. Her husband died. She moved closer to her mother around here. It's easier to raise a child when grandma's around. Yes, not her biological father, of course, but still. Emily remembered what was written in the detective's report. Nikki was indeed a widow at the time of the disappearance. However, she had never given birth to any children. She lost a child at a late stage due to the stress of her husband's death. She lost her own child but decided to steal mine. Emily fought. She slowly exited the store and sat down on a bench. After waiting for several hours, she finally saw the kidnapper and her daughter return. Emily approached the woman decisively. "Nikki, can I have a moment?" Nikki looked at Emily cautiously, and the girl stared at the stranger. "It won't take long." Emily forced a smile. "Let's talk in private." "Sonia, go home," Nikki instructed her daughter, who reluctantly disappeared into the entrance. 10 years ago, Emily immediately grabbed Nikki's hand. "On Christmas Eve, you stole my daughter and shattered my life, you wretch." Nikki turned pale and clutched her chest. "I hate you so much, you have no idea. I had a family, love, and happiness, and you took it all away for your own selfishness," Emily exclaimed. The kidnapper gasped for breath and stammered, "I don't know why. I wasn't myself. Sonia looks so much like my husband, and I just lost my mind back then. I had no idea what I was doing. Sonia is such a bright child. I couldn't let go." Nikki cried, "I saw it all. I saw how you were searching for her, but I thought you could still have more children. For me, this was my last chance and my last hope. Please understand. Her name is Michelle. She's my daughter. I'm not ready to shatter her life and take away what she has. So, listen to me. Make sure she's happy. Turn your life around for her, but know that I'll be watching you until my last breath," Emily said. Emily lowered her head heavily and walked away. Tears rolled down Nikki's cheeks. She realized that she would never have a peaceful day in her life again. Gabriel walked out of the art center, her soul singing. In a nearby garden, there sat a man with a book. Gabriel squinted, then immediately smiled. The actress approached the man and sat down next to him. "I got the role," she told her former fellow passenger. Rodrigo raised his eyes from the book and stared at Gabriel. "We flew together. Have you forgotten?" she asked. "How could I forget you?" the former pilot replied, glancing at the lace sleeves of the actress's dress. "So, congratulations on your dream coming true." "Thank you." Gabriel crossed her legs and took a thin cigarette holder from her purse. "Now I'll be living here, performing in the local theater. A new chapter. How wonderful," she said as she lit a cigarette. "By the way, are you a local?" "Yeah. I know you saved all of us. They say hijackers took control of the plane, but we didn't even notice." "What?" Rodrigo exclaimed, taken aback. "That's not true at all. I overheard some things while the police were questioning us. The ship's captain was supposed to crash the plane, and you neutralized the threat like a true hero, safely landing us. I know everything," the actress said. Rodrigo frowned. "Come on, that's nonsense. It wasn't like that at all. You have such interesting eyes and cheekbones. How about some coffee?" Gabriel abruptly changed the subject. The man was astonished. In all his long life, he had never encountered such an eccentric and candid individual. "Coffee?" Gabriel asked. Yes, let's go to a cafe. Tell me how everything really happened, and I'll invite you to the premiere of my play. Just keep in mind, it's a serious piece. No snoring allowed, and showing up without flowers is also not an option. The flowers, of course, are for me." The old bachelor Rodrigo suddenly felt incredibly flustered. He awkwardly stashed his half-read book into his pocket and rose from the bench. "Well then, let's go to the cafe," he offered, extending his hand to the woman. Gabriel gracefully intertwined her fingers with his and smiled. "A new life begins rather intriguingly," the actress thought. Jorge was delivering a welcome speech at the branch opening. Words flowed smoothly from his mouth, but his eyes were scanning the crowd for his deputy. There he was, Michael, dressed in a formal suit, standing discreetly in the far corner near a column. As always, unobtrusive, somewhat serious, and quiet. After concluding the opening ceremony, Jorge made his way through the celebrating crowd. "Hello, Michael. So, what brings you here?" he inquired. "It's personal," Michael replied darkly, holding a champagne glass in his hand. "You were so worried about my flight. Did you have a strange dream like my mother did?" Jorge pressed. Jorge scrutinized his deputy's face carefully. The sense of unease did not leave him. Michael didn't have a chance to respond because two strong men approached him from both sides. Pointing at the deputy's face with their identification, one of them mumbled his rank and surname, then strongly invited Michael to follow them. Jorge's heart sank. His suspicions were not unfounded. But if everything was as he suspected, could the modest genius Michael be capable of such a heinous crime? 2 days later, the second pilot, Terry, finally regained consciousness. He would occasionally emerge from his slumber, but each time his vision was blurry and his head was buzzing. This time, the second pilot saw clearly: white hospital walls, and floor stand, and a girl by the bed holding a book. When she noticed movement, she raised her eyes and smiled. Dimples appeared on her cheeks. "Awake at last," she said. Yes, awake." "And you?" Terry replied. "I'm Elizabeth. You probably don't remember me. We were seated next to each other throughout the entire flight." Terry furrowed his brow and then smiled. "It was you who applied the towel to my forehead and held my hand, right?" he asked. "Well, yes." Elizabeth averted her gaze. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. After all, you were my patient." Terry suddenly felt embarrassed. "I must look terrible. How many days have I been lying here? I haven't washed or groomed myself. Horrible." "What happened in the end?" he finally asked Elizabeth. "The plane was safely landed by a heroic man, a retired pilot. Your captain's family is fine. No one was taken hostage. As for the captain, he resigned. I'm not very well informed, but it seems like they didn't press charges against him. But if you file a complaint, they probably will. He did hit you, after all." "No, I have no intention of filing anything." Terry shook his head. "He's a good man. No one can say how they'd behave in his place. No one." "You're very forgiving," Elizabeth said, flashing her dimples again. The young people chatted for a while longer. Suddenly, Jorge, followed by the senior flight attendant Julie and Rodrigo, arm in arm with actress Gabriel, appeared in the room. Terry, who had spent most of the flight in an unconscious state, only recognized Julie among them. Elizabeth quickly introduced everyone, and the pilot nodded in confusion. "We've all been through such stress," Gabriel said, placing her delicate hand on her forehead. Rodrigo almost imperceptibly smirked. In fact, Gabriel had no idea what was happening throughout the entire flight. Rodrigo explained. "I was very worried and suspected something." Jorge laughed, looking at the actress's displeased face. "Actually, Gabriel, I had no idea either," he admitted. For a while, the incident's participants discussed what had happened. Finally, Jorge's expression darkened. "I must apologize to all of you. The captain isn't here now, but it seems that the consequences for Harold have been more destructive than for anyone else. And it turns out that I'm indirectly responsible for what happened." Everyone looked at Jorge in surprise. Julie spoke up. "Jorge, you helped us throughout the flight." "What are you talking about? If it weren't for you, if you hadn't opened the cockpit door, who knows how it would have ended? I can't even imagine." Jorge sighed. "I don't know if it's appropriate to tell you everything now." "Absolutely appropriate." Gabriel gracefully perched on the windowsill. "So, Jorge, we're listening. Confess." She made a sweeping hand gesture as if inviting Jorge to kneel. Jorge gathered his courage. In fact, over the past couple of days, he had been to the police station several times. He had spoken with the investigator and given endless testimonies. A heavy burden weighed on his soul. It turned out that the mastermind behind the incident was none other than his own deputy, Michael, a former classmate and friend whom Jorge had taken everywhere with him. Honestly, Jorge still hadn't fully grasped what had happened. To what extent must someone have descended into hatred to plan such a heinous crime that, if successful, would have claimed the lives of hundreds of people? At first, Michael had withdrawn into himself and refused to testify. But when he saw Jorge and heard comforting words from him, Michael exploded. His angry words were etched forever in Jorge's memory. "Playing the nice guy again," Michael said. You deliberately kept me around just to look better, didn't you? Jorge was dumbfounded, unable to believe his ears. He had genuinely admired this guy's talents. He was willing to learn his whole life just to reach the same level. Yes, he and Michael were quite different, but that's why Jorge thought they complemented each other. That's why he invited him to work together. That's why he tried to make it more comfortable for Michael to socialize with other people. And here, this was how Michael saw it all. He believed Jorge looked down on him, that he condescended to a gloomy misfit and used his accomplishments for his own gain. He made me his deputy just to humiliate me, Michael shouted, glaring at Jorge. You've trampled me in the dirt all your life just to show off. No girl will look at me when you're around. No one wants to socialize when you're nearby. You're a star, Jorge. During the interrogation, it was revealed that Michael had long harbored hatred for his friend. It turns out he had hated Jorge since their student days. Jorge was surprised to learn that every girl Michael had ever liked ended up preferring to have a romance with Jorge. However, how could he have known when Michael kept silent like a guerrilla fighter? Working together with Jorge, Michael continued to accumulate his anger. They had both come here almost at the same time, but the company's management had offered a partnership to the talented Jorge, not Michael. Jorge was listed as the full-fledged leader, while Michael was stuck with the humiliating position of deputy. In short, no matter what Jorge did for his old friend, in Michael's eyes, it all looked like mockery and a pitiful handout. A few months ago, a fairly influential competing firm reached out to Michael. They asked him to join them, but not just on a whim. They wanted him to bring in significant clients. That's when Michael came up with a brilliant plan. He would get rid of Jorge, and then, as his deputy, he would lure the clients away and leave for the very same competitors. According to Michael, as long as there was chaos in the company due to Jorge's death, he would have time to execute his plan. He would start with the opening of the branch. What could be better than seizing the opportunity while both top executives were absent? Michael was indeed a genius. He excelled in electronics, could assemble gadgets from completely unrelated parts, and had been passionate about radio technology since childhood. He hatched his monstrous plan in just a couple of days. When the company's head was hospitalized with appendicitis, Michael realized that Jorge would be sent to oversee the branch's opening. To begin with, Michael hacked the employee database of American Airlines and found out everything about the captain of the aircraft, Harold. Then, just before takeoff, he lured Harold's entire family, and as a precaution, he hacked Cynthia's phone, cutting off communication from it. From video clips on Harold's wife's smartphone, he hastily assembled a cry from one of the children to make his threat seem more credible. And then the evil genius had that conversation with Captain Harold, threatening his family's demise. This is unbelievable, the second pilot exclaimed, eyes wide. To eliminate one person, this monster was willing to destroy an entire plane. Jorge nodded grimly. He too couldn't make sense of what had happened. He just hoped that Michael would undergo psychiatric evaluation and face trial as soon as possible. He needs to be put away for life, Gabriel interjected sharply. We all, in a way, found ourselves under the sword of Damocles because of the ambitions of a complex psychopath. Well, you know, Rodrigo said, there was a case where a pilot in depression crashed a plane with passengers into a mountain. So, cases where hundreds suffer because of one person do happen. Obviously, this guy is a sociopath. The former passengers of Flight 415 spent a little more time by the bedside of the second pilot, and then began to disperse. I'll go too. Elizabeth smiled at Terry and handed him a piece of paper. Here's my number. If you need anything, call me, well, or write. After all, I'm practically your treating doctor. Can't I just write to you without a reason? Terry suddenly asked seriously. Elizabeth chuckled. Of course you can. As Jorge left the hospital, he looked up at the sky and closed his eyes. He still couldn't believe that everything that had happened wasn't some crazy dream. Behind him, he heard hearty laughter. He turned around to find actress Gabriel, handing him the arm of former aircraft captain Rodrigo, laughing merrily. Jorge, with a smile, watched the eccentric lady. Hey, programmer, Gabriel waved her hand. Come to my premiere. I'll think about it. Jorge smiled. Maybe I'll bring my mom here, take her to the theater. Mom, Gabriel squinted. How old is your mom? Is she pretty? The actress cast a fleeting glance at Rodrigo. No, you see, Gabriel replied. I don't need you to pester me with your moms. Just go where you are heading. Taking in the situation, Jorge chuckled and continued on his way with a leisurely pace. 6 months later, the former passengers and several members of Flight 415 Escree gathered at the most luxurious restaurant in town. Jorge had stayed in the city for a while on the occasion of the opening of the branch, so he had gotten quite used to it. The reason for the gathering was the sentencing of Michael. The scoundrel had long tried to play the part of a madman, but a psychiatric evaluation had deemed him sane. And how many years did they give him? Gabriel swirled her wine in her glass. 20 years, Jorge replied, recalling his last meeting with his former friend. One question had been haunting him, and he finally asked it. Michael, explain why, with your brilliant mind, you couldn't come up with a simpler way to get rid of your detested competitor. Didn't it even cross your mind that you were sentencing so many people to death who had done nothing wrong to you? Michael, who had grown a beard during his time in detention and looked darker than usual, smirked sarcastically. They didn't do anything wrong to me, yes. Well, maybe they didn't do anything specific, yes. But each of them is part of the society that rejected me my entire life. Has anyone ever felt sorry for me? No. No one accepted me all these years. So why should I feel sorry for them? Jorge looked at his former classmate in horror. This man truly believed that the whole world was against him. He didn't notice any good intentions toward himself, didn't see friendly gestures or genuine goodwill because within Michael's soul, a dark void ruled, and he had no desire to fill it with anything more. How is Captain Harold doing? Jorge asked sympathetically. He felt the greatest guilt towards this man because it was due to Michael's vengeance that Harold had lost his reputation, job, and narrowly avoided going to prison. He's doing well, Second Pilot Terry happily replied. He retired due to his years of service, opened a small family store. Overall, he's quite content with his life, raising his children. He says he's enjoying the company of his beloved Cynthia, and Cynthia herself says that she'll finally stop waking up in cold sweats at night. She said that even if there was a chance to keep the captain's position, she wouldn't allow it after what happened. Jorge sighed. He looked around at the group. The second pilot was enjoying the company of Elizabeth, who was happily displaying dimples on her round cheeks. Jorge knew that after her grandmother's funeral, Elizabeth had reconciled with her family, enrolled in medical school, and had started building a relationship with Terry. Actress Gabriel was shining in the local theater. After each performance, former captain of the aircraft Rodrigo would meet her with a bouquet and lead her away, arm in arm, in an unknown direction. Meanwhile, Jorge worked at the new branch tirelessly, trying to forget the horrors of what had happened. He also wanted to forget the betrayal of his friend. His mother had long been nagging him about not having a partner. Jorge turned his head and locked eyes with the head flight attendant, Julie. She quickly averted her gaze. Julie, care to dance? Jorge extended his hand to the girl, who nodded in agreement. From the other flight attendants, there was suppressed laughter and loud whispers. Finally, someone said, outside the large panoramic window, fluffy snow was falling. In the warm restaurant hall, people who had become a little closer due to the remarkable turn of events were engaged in lively conversations around a big table.